There is a farm in Bavaria. It sits at the end of a road that leads nowhere else. In the spring of 1922, 6 people lived there. None of them would survive the month of March. But here's what will keep you awake tonight. It wasn't just that they were murdered, it's what happened afterward. The killer didn't leave. Part 1. The farm at the end of the road. To understand what happened at Hinterkaifeck, you first need to understand what Hinterkaifeck was. The name itself is German for behind the edge, and that's exactly what it was. A small, isolated farmstead deep in the Bavarian countryside, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. No neighbors within shouting distance, no main road nearby. Just fields, forest, and silence. In 1922, the farm was home to 6 people. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, 63 years old, a hard man, a stubborn man, the kind of farmer who had survived wars, famines, and decades of brutal Bavarian winters simply by refusing to be weak. He owned the land, he owned the house, and in many ways, he owned the people in it. His wife, Cecilia Gruber, 72 years old, quiet, steady. She had spent her life on this farm and likely expected to die on it, though not like this. Then there was Victoria Gabriel, their widowed daughter, 35 years old. Her husband had died in the First World War, or so everyone believed. She had 2 children still living at home. A daughter, also named Cecilia, just 7 years old, and a 2-year-old boy named Joseph, and finally, a new maid. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old. She had arrived at the farm just that morning, her very first day, her last. 6 people, 1 farm, 1 murderer, and a crime so cold, so deliberate, so utterly baffling that it remains unsolved to this day over 100 years later. Part 2. Something is wrong. But before we get to the night of the murders, we need to talk about the days leading up to them. Because the horror of Hinterkaifeck didn't begin with a weapon. It began with a footprint. In the days before the murders, it was late March 1922. Andreas Gruber noticed something strange in the snow around the farm. A trail of footprints coming from the direction of the forest, leading toward the house. But there were no footprints going back. Think about that for a moment. Someone or something walked out of the woods toward the Gruber farmhouse, and then nothing. No prints returning, no explanation. Andreas mentioned this to neighbors. He was not an easily frightened man, but he was disturbed. He didn't know what to make of it, but the footprints were just the beginning. He also reported hearing footsteps in the attic at night. Andreas would lie awake and listen. Someone was above him, moving slowly, deliberately in the darkness overhead. Then there was the newspaper. Andreas found a newspaper inside the house that he didn't subscribe to, didn't recognize, couldn't account for. It was just there, as if someone had left it. And then the keys vanished. The house keys went missing. No explanation, no sign of forced entry. They were simply gone. Now, a rational person might say, Andreas, pack up your family and leave. Go to the police. Go to a neighbor, do something. He didn't. And he wasn't the first to sense something was wrong with that farm. Weeks earlier, The previous maid, a woman who had worked there for some time, abruptly quit. She refused to give a specific reason, but she told people the house felt wrong, that something was there, that she wanted nothing more to do with it. People in the village later said she claimed the house was haunted. She was right that something was there. She was wrong about what it was. Part 3. The night of March 31st, 1922. We do not know exactly what hour it happened. We do not know what triggered it. We do not know what was said, or if anything was said at all. What we know is this. Between the evening of March 31st and the early hours of April 1st, 1922, every single person on the Hinterkaifeck farm was murdered. The weapon was a mattock, a farming tool, heavy, blunt, the kind of thing you'd find in any barn in Bavaria. And it appears, based on the evidence investigators found afterward, that the victims were lured to the barn, one at a time, not all at once, not in a frenzy, one by one. The first to be killed were Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia Gabriel. They were found in the barn, their bodies partially buried under hay. Each one had been struck multiple times. Inside the farmhouse, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was killed in her bed. She'd been there less than 12 hours. And little Joseph, the 2-year-old boy, was killed in his crib. But perhaps the most haunting detail of all, and there are many, involves young Cecilia Gabriel, the 7-year-old girl. When her body was found, investigators noticed something. Clutched in her hands, tightly, as if in a death grip, were clumps of her own hair. She had been alive after the attack, long enough to pull out her own hair in terror and anguish, long enough to lie among the dead, alone in the dark, in that barn, and wait. She was 7 years old. Part 4. Nobody noticed. Here is something that most true crime cases don't have. Here is the part that transforms this from a terrible murder into something else entirely. After the murders, the farm kept going. The chimney kept smoking. Neighbors passing by saw it, assumed the Grubers were inside, warm, going about their lives. Nothing to worry about. The animals were fed, the cows, the pigs, the chickens. They were cared for. Daily, systematically. Bread was cut in the kitchen, fresh. Someone had eaten there. For nearly a week, almost certainly longer, heck. Whoever committed these murders lived on the farm, slept in the beds, ate the food, fed the animals, maintained the appearance of a functioning household. The Gruber family had been annihilated, and their killer had simply moved in, going through the motions of farm life, watching the road, waiting. For what? We don't know. It wasn't until April 4th, 4 full days after the murders, that neighbors became genuinely alarmed. Andreas had missed a market. Victoria hadn't been seen. Mail was piling up. Something was wrong. A group of neighbors went to investigate. What they found in that barn will be remembered for as long as that farmhouse stood. 6 bodies, 1 farm, and a fire still burning in the hearth. Part 5. The investigation and why it failed. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was, to put it charitably, a disaster. It's important to understand the context. This was 1922, rural Bavaria. Forensic science, as we understand it, essentially did not exist. Crime scene preservation was not a standard practice. The farm was swarmed by neighbors, journalists, curious onlookers. all trampling what little evidence might have existed. The bodies were eventually exhumed and sent to Munich for examination. The heads were removed and sent to a clairvoyant, yes, a psychic, in the hopes that someone could read the faces of the dead and identify the killer. This was not a high point for investigative procedure. Over 100 suspects were questioned. Over 100. The investigation dragged on for years. Suspects included former workers, neighbors, relatives, anyone who might have had access to the farm, a grudge against the Grubers, or knowledge of the property. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The case went cold. The farm was eventually demolished, and Hinterkaifeck faded from the headlines until the internet rediscovered it decades later and brought it back into the light. Part 6. What does the evidence tell us? Let's be honest about what the evidence can and cannot tell us. The murders were committed by someone with physical strength. A mattock is not an easy weapon to use effectively, especially against multiple victims. The methodical way the victims were separated and killed suggests planning, patience, and familiarity with the space. There was no sign of robbery. Money was left in the house, untouched. This eliminates opportunistic theft as a motive. Whatever drove the killer to Hinterkaifeck was personal. The killer's decision to stay on the farm afterward is the most psychologically unusual element. Most murderers flee. They go to ground. They create distance. Staying at the scene, feeding the animals, cooking food, sleeping in the beds, suggests one of a few things. 1. The killer had nowhere to go. They were already living on or near the property and had no other shelter. 2. The killer was hiding something on the farm and needed time to deal with it. 3. The killer was disturbed in a way that went beyond ordinary criminal behavior. Someone who had psychologically already claimed the farm as their own before the murders ever happened. All three of these possibilities align most closely with the person in the attic theory. Not perfectly, but better than any alternative. Who do you think committed these murders? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.